Welcome everybody to the Banyan Books podcast. My name is Ross McKeechee, and today we are excited to be in conversation with Dr. Stephen Porges. Now, before I get to his formal introduction, I'll make our usual Banyan announcements. First off, acknowledging that although we have people joining from everywhere in the world, the physical location of Banyan Books and Sound in Vancouver is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Banyan Books is in its 50th anniversary year this year, 50 years as a local independent bookstore, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Everybody, please support your local independent bookstores. Every time you make a purchase from Banyan Books, it helps to support these kinds of wonderful programs like we're having with you today. Our website is banyan.com. That's BANYEN.com. Now, our honored guest today, Dr. Stephen W. Porges. He, in 1994, proposed the polyvagal theory. In 2011, after decades of research, he published his first book on the subject. The polyvagal theory took the therapeutic world by storm, bringing Dr. Porges' insights about the autonomic nervous system to a clinical audience interested in understanding trauma, anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. A little bit of context and background regarding our guest. Dr. Porges is Distinguished University Scientist at Indiana University, where he is the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium in the Kinsey Institute. He is professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and professor emeritus at both the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Maryland. He served as president of the Society for Psychophysiological Research and the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and is a former recipient of a National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientist Development Award. He has published more than 350 peer-reviewed scientific papers across several disciplines, including biomedical engineering, critical care medicine, exercise physiology, neuroscience, pediatrics, psychiatry, psychology, and substance abuse. He is the world's leading expert on the relationship between the autonomic nervous system, a neural system that oversees largely unconscious functions such as heart rate and digestion, and social behavior. He holds several patents involved in monitoring and regulating autonomic state with applications in mental and physical health. He's also the creator of a music-based intervention, the Safe and Sound Protocol, which currently is used by more than 2,000 therapists to improve spontaneous social engagement, to reduce hearing sensitivities, and to improve language processing and state regulation. Dr. Porges is the author of a number of books, including The Polyvagal Theory, The Pocket Guide to Polyvagal Theory, and is co-editor of Clinical Applications of the Polyvagal Theory. Today, he is here in conversation with Banyan Books about his brand new book, Polyvagal Safety: Attachment, Communication, Self-Regulation. Dr. Gabor Mate says of this book, "It is nuanced, richly detailed, and written with clarity. Polyvagal safety is a matchless gift to physicians and therapists, and to all students of the body's inextricable unity with the psyche." So Banyan Books community, please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Stephen Porges. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you for the very flattering and introduction. I'm sitting here listening to it and saying, what is this guy going to be talking about? But thank you for welcoming me on your podcast.
So nice to have you here. And what a wonderful book that you've put out. I'm curious, what was your central aim in building on polyvagal?
Okay, when I developed polyvagal theory, we go back into the 1990s, and just like I was going to say, just like Banyan books, I've been around since I was an assistant professor in 1970, so there are parallel uh, trajectories of maturation. Uh, but what you can see, and even in the sense of reading my bio, longevity helps, persistence helps, and embedded in that there is some quality. So, in a sense, being around and being reasonably good enables you to have, let's say, portals of influence and where ideas can be translated. But there's an interesting narrative or backstory, and that is to be able to leverage academic or scientific credentials and ideas and move it into the clinical world requires that you have to be accepted within your academic discipline. So, there are a lot of what we would call in the world, when I put on my hat as the aggressive academic, a lot of failed academicians out there writing books and telling people what to do. But I actually serve an interesting, or have, let's say, served an interesting role, and that was to maintain the academic credibility, the science credibility, and then to translate it and bridge it into the clinical world. So I was not a clinician, but I would say that the greatest compliment that I've ever been paid is that he has a heart like a clinician. So he's a researcher, but with a heart like a clinician. And I think that is the real word here, and that makes me feel good, because it's all about translation of ideas into practice to make the world better. And that's been the journey. Now, to get really at your question, where did this all kind of come from? The Over the years, when I started, in a sense, articulating polyvagal theory, it was really about that we had different physiological circuits, different autonomic states that promoted different types of behaviors. So, like if we're in one physiological state, we can be social, we can be spontaneously engaging, we can be in close proximity with another. When we shift into another physiological state, the world's our enemy, and we're reactive to everyone. No one can come close. And then if we experience life threat, which many survivors of trauma have, then their presence in the world is literally to shut down, disappear, and dissociate. So I developed this theory based upon the existing literature on the evolution of the autonomic nervous system. So there's evolution, there's comparative neuroanatomy, and when you start putting that together with developmental physiology and developmental behaviors and with clinical pathology, suddenly the world just springs out at you. And the first rule is that our autonomic nervous system goes into different states, just like ice, water, or steam. Different properties when it's in these different states. The other part of it is that those states, or the repertoire of our states, are basically a gift of evolution, and that we evolved. Ancient vertebrates, when they were under threat, they shut down. And then as vertebrates evolved to bony fish, you start getting a sympathetic nervous system, a spinal sympathetic nervous system. And then this remains the two major systems that are there for reptiles. Reptiles shut down or they're aggressive. But mammals come into the world with something different. Mammals actually, I like to use this term, there's this evolutionary birthright, and that was that enabled them through their interactions with one another to turn off their threat reactions. So our sociality became the bridge that enabled us to mitigate threat reactions. And that became proximity and bonding. It became relationship building, parenting. We have all kinds of terms we can use, but the basic word is trust. And the act of trusting a person enables that sociality, that interaction, that co-regulation to be elevated to a role of neuromodulation. So this is, in a sense, almost oblique to how many people would talk. But what I'm saying is that our social behavior has the capacity to turn off threat reactions. Now, after I said that, you can hear it, and you say, oh, what's so special about that? we have babies, we calm them down. We have dogs, we calm them down. But how do we calm them down? We are sending them cues of safety that their nervous system has no choice but to accept. Intonation of voice, the gestures. Polyvagal theory deconstructs what we already knew. So there's nothing new in polyvagal theory, except we now give it a language that's consistent with our evolution and with our science.
Fantastic. Now, speaking of languaging, after you came out with polyvagal theory, the ways that it could be used are so broad.
Mhm.
And you came up with 4 new constructs that you felt were important to communicate these relevant theories
Yeah.
to therapists. Can you tell us about those 4
Well, you
constructs?
might have to remind me, but
Sure,
because, no, the
sure,
reason is that it could be. I think we're going to go. Well, why don't you ask each one, and I'll tell you
sure.
how.
Well, starting with vagal break.
Yeah. So, in a sense, this idea, let's visualize we have this nervous system that evolved that can turn off threat reactions. It does that through a new innovation of it, the vagal system, part of the parasympathetic component of the autonomic nervous system, through functionally a braking mechanism. It's a cardio inhibitory, meaning it slows the heart rate. So when people get anxious and mobilized, often they feel their heart pounding, their heart's racing, and in their mind, they have to move. And often they develop narratives about why they have to move. And now we have people in fights or arguments with passion because they're physiologically mobilized. But what this says is that if I can recruit that vagal system, it works like a brake. It works reflexively and immediately. It will just calm me down. And this, you can see this with babies who are in tantrums, and if a mother is using a prosodic voice, gesture, the baby calms down.
Right.
If the father comes in and yells at the baby's not going to calm down. There are things that are so obvious. Then you can say, well, what about fathers? And what do they do with their puppies? They're really great, and so in a sense, we have our social roles as parents. As fathers, we often think we have to create boundaries and discipline, and the mother can do the soft stuff. But with our dog, we'll do everything. So we'll use a pet ease voice. We'll talk like we're talking to a baby. But the dog's nervous system detects those intonations just like a baby does. And remember, it's the intonation of the voice, not the words. This is all pre-verbal, and dogs don't understand that many words.
Right. So tone of voice is so key for communicating trust.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. I'm going to help you along on this through the other construct, which is neuroception. And neuroception is this system wired into our body that detects either risk or cues of safety. Now, the detection of risk has been well known, and that's been basically emphasized in all, let's say, psychological, psychobiological research as, threat reactions. We all know that. So virtually every living organism has a defense system, no question. But in that evolutionary transition from asocial reptiles to social mammals, mammals got another tool, not just a tool for defense, but a tool that turned off their defenses, calmed them down, made them feel safe. And that became, in a sense, the tipping point in vertebrate evolution that enabled sociality. And to quote another person from Vancouver, Gabor, who you mentioned earlier, he talks about this in terms of humanity. And I talk about it in terms of sociality, but we're talking about the same thing. The core of being a human is his ability to co-regulate and to send cues back and forth. And these cues are detected outside of awareness. So they're not perception. They're really rapid. If they were perception, we detect it, we evaluate it, and we make a decision. Neuroception works through brain structures but it avoids becoming conscious, because if it were conscious, it would be too slow. We would not be around. And because of that, it makes some mistakes, and sometimes it does things that we're really not comfortable with. So we use terms like, I have this gut feeling about this person. And you might ask, say, well, tell me why do you have that feeling? And did you agree with what the person was saying? Oh yeah. But there's something about that person that makes me feel uncomfortable, and I don't trust them or her. And it has a lot to do with these projections of vocalizations and motor gestures, because we are literally broadcasting our physiological state in our voice and on our face. And that is also part of polyvagal theory, because the nerves that control vocal intonation are vagal nerves that parallel the cardioinhibitory ones on our heart. And functionally, it was that vocalization uh, adaptation that mammals had that created this bridge to sociality. They could broadcast their physiological state to another one of their species, and then you get closer. You're not going to be eaten, you're not going to be bitten. But remember, we detect that in people's voices today, and what do we tell ourselves? Forget that. Listen to the words.
Right. Now, the other construct was social engagement system. The
Yeah,
social engagement.
this was, I had already, in a sense, come out with the theory. And then I started to, in a sense, elaborate in terms of how does this theory work in the real world? How does it work? So I had to come up with this concept of how do you trigger these different physiological states. If I detect safety, I trigger the calm state. If I detect imminent danger, I trigger the sympathetic system so I can mobilize, fight, and flee. And if I have overwhelming odds that I'm going to die, I disappear, I dissociate, I shut down. And you can start seeing the adaptation, the adaptive function of each of those, and you can see it even in other mammals. So you have that model. So that became the neuroception. Then I wanted to figure out what was this whole circuit that had the face and the voice, like I was bringing up, and how did that circuit interact with those cardioinhibitory vagal fibers, which seem like it's a little obtuse, but it's all part of the same system, that our voice and our heart and our face and our heart are how we negotiate social distance, uh, proximity, and functionally being able to touch each other without our bodies going into a defensive mode. So when I started to study the neuroanatomy really carefully, I started to find this interesting, let's call it a backstory. So if we can think of vagal neurons as actors in this story, the vagal neurons at that transition from reptiles to mammals go for a hike. They start going on a journey, and they actually move from the back of the brainstem, a dorsal area of the brainstem, that even in mammals regulates our gut and below our diaphragm, and they start traveling ventrally, and then they meet up in the area of the brainstem that regulates the muscles of the face and head, and that creates this new ventral vagal complex. But it also has uh, uh, the neurons that regulate all the striated muscles of the face and head. So our expressivity, our adjustive behavior, even the muscles that regulate our middle ear, which enables us to hear human voice in background noise. It's all part of the same system. So when people are safe, they can hear what people are saying. When they are mobilized or scared, they can hear background sounds, predator sounds, but the frequency band of human voice gets buried. They can't hear it. Now, within psychology, people say, well, the priorities change. Within polyvagal theory, it says, don't go so deep. It's simple. The transfer function of these physical mechanisms that allow sounds to get into the inner ear change when you're under a state of threat versus when you're safe. So this goes into, you mentioned you had an interest in autism.
Yes.
Autistic kids had been, in a sense, inappropriately chastised for not listening to human voice. And uh, they were auditorily hypersensitive, but they couldn't understand or hear human voice. And everyone went ballistic. You're not hearing because you don't want to. Therefore, we need to use conditioning procedures. But the function of what they were sensitive to were primarily low frequency sounds, which are predator sounds, ventilation sounds, air conditioners, traffic noise, ventilation systems, elevators. You know it because if you talk to families with autistic kids, you'll get the array, but they can't extract the human voice because the frequency then of human voice was being masked by the low frequency sounds. Polyvagal theory explained that and then said, what happens if we can now rehabilitate that system?
Right.
And then what happens? So we have vagal brake, we have neuroception. Now, let me basically the secret of that social engagement system is where did those cardio inhibitory vagal fibers go? They went to a brainstem area, a column that regulated all the striated muscles that evolved from the ancient gill arches. So now we have a neural system that is controlling musculature that creates vocalizations, listening, and expression, facial expression. And it's not merely correlated with, it's integrated with the cardioinhibitory, meaning it's slowing up the heart when you're calm and it's pulling that brake off if there's threat. And when there's threat, what happens to people's faces? They go flat. What happens to their voices? They get higher pitch, less prosody, less melodic features, less vagal vocal tone.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered vagal brake, the social engagement system, neuroception, and you've covered a fair bit. Maybe you can touch on it again. The frequency band of perceptual advantage was the fourth.
Yeah, that was actually an interesting kind of discovery as I was, let's say, piloting around. The point is that when we look at the frequencies that humans use to extract cues of social communication, they're very well defined. And we can find that all mammals, based on the physics of those middle ear structures, have a sweet spot. So they have a frequency band for many of the mammals. They call them ultrasounds, but they're audible to these small mammals. The point is, based on the physics, we know where to look to find where the social communication is going. Because to process that frequency band of perceptual advantage, where it's easy for me to hear your voice, I am functionally giving up my hypervigilance for predator sounds. Because predator sounds are low frequency sounds. And the actual process to get there is not I have to think it, it's that the muscles regulating the middle ear structures have to now tense up and they tighten the eardrum. And what that means is the low frequency sounds, rather than permeating the middle ear and going into the inner ear, bounce off. So when we start talking about autistic kids or kids with auditory hypersensitivities, they tend to have language delays or language problems because they're not getting the information in that perceptual band of that perceptual frequent band of advantage.
Okay, thank you. Now, in chapter 4 of polyvagal safety, I was very interested. Chapter 4 is titled Vagal Pathways as Portals to Compassion. I was really interested. Can you illuminate what
I,
polyvagal theory tells us about compassion?
well, I think it goes to really I think where you want to lead the discussion. Where did the title come from? Polyvagal safety. And what polyvagal theory teaches us that turning off of threat reactions, which means our body's in a state of safety, is where where everything that makes us human comes from. So whether we want to talk about spirituality or compassion, we're not going to be a spiritual species or a compassionate species if we're under constant threat. And polyvagal theory says it's not just taking away threat. That's okay, that's good. That's not sufficient. You take away threat, but you need to have cues of safety. So what we start learning is that if we go through, let's say, traditions of contemplative sciences, and there's certain environments and certain practices, you find out that those practices are usually vagal exercises like chanting or posture shifts or breathing. They're neural exercises of that ventral safety vagal circuit. And they're often done, and I even describe in that chapter, cathedrals. What happens in the cathedral where they often have these enormous organs that are playing very low frequencies? And those frequencies under the normal situation would be terrifying because they are the frequencies of predators. But within a safe environment, it now gives you a spiritual feeling of awe. So, because you're in these cathedrals, which are really fortresses. So, there's a lot of interaction between the stimulation, the physical characteristics of places, and the personal experiences one has. So, in that chapter, I kind of basically say that we need to be safe to be compassionate, and we need to be, and that includes self compassion. That if we're in a world that is under constant threat and we are constantly blaming ourselves, creating the threat onto ourselves, then our chances of being compassionate and being a good witness to another are greatly reduced.
Right. It was really interesting to see you made a very clear distinction between compassion and empathy.
Yeah,
Can you talk
got
about that?
it got me into trouble because many of my close friends had functionally branded empathy as a type of therapy they were giving or using, and I was saying, really, when you deal in the world of trauma and mental health disorders, you don't want to be empathic. You want to be compassionate. And if you go into, in a sense, the science of empathy versus how it's used within the clinical world may not be the same thing. So I started to talk in this mode as the scientist. The scientist says empathy is really where our body mimics the pain of others. And then from my own knowledge of interacting with many people who have lived through severe traumas, they don't want their story, their narrative, to hurt others. So they don't even want to tell about themselves because people cringe and say, "Oh, we have to get back at these people," or you have to have justice or righteousness. That's not what they want, at least initially. They want to be heard. They want their voice. They want to be witnessed. So I started to say that my friends who were calling their therapies empathy based, I said, I've watched you do your work. It's not empathy, it's compassion, because you're able to uh, respect and honor the other person's feelings without letting that other person's feelings overwhelm you. And that's what an empathic experience would be.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now, I was also particularly interested in chapter 5, which is on yoga therapy and polyvagal theory. Of course, I'm a practitioner of yoga, a student of yoga. Can you tell us a bit about the how this is an ancient science? What does polyvagal theory bring and help illuminate in parallel to yogic science?
Well, I think what polyvagal theory does, it provides a parallel mapping of what was already embedded in yoga, in a sense, the understanding of underlying states, how we react. In a sense, the chapter, which is primarily driven by Mariah Sullivan, uh, is really focuses on what do I'd say trauma yoga therapists and yoga practitioners, what are they doing? It's really saying that the core of yoga is not solely a belief system. It's literally a science system under a different name. And what polyvagal theory gives to yoga is a translation. It says what you are doing can be translated into contemporary neuroscience. And I think that helps people, it helps them feel validated. And the issue, remember, part of the world of yoga and part of the world of mental health is the dismissiveness of medicine about mental health, traditionally, of saying, oh, it's just in your head. Polyvagal theory in yoga say that it's not just in your head, it's in your body. It's an integrated neural reaction. And that's why many people who have certain types of disorders will gravitate to yoga because it makes them feel better, but they don't have the language to basically say yoga is a neural exercise that leads to a better embodiment, or let's say, in a science level, a more enhanced brain visceral organ regulation. So what you're doing with yogic exercises is you're doing neural exercises of your basically viscera and your skeletal motor systems.
Right. And you bring together the philosophy of yoga that talks about the three gunas, the three qualities of material nature, with these neural platforms, the
Yeah.
ventral vagal, sympathetic nervous system, and dorsal vagal complex. Can you tell us how those parallel?
Um, well, what I would not really, but the parallel is quite, I would say, it's just different names for the same things. And so if one set of language or set of terms is defining a structure that leads to certain types of functions, that's what yoga is doing as well. It's saying this is what emerges from these states. And polyvagal theory just uses a different language. Um, so I don't think it's anything different. What I'm really trying to say is that there's okay. So if it's doing the same thing, why is it necessary? So the answer for that is that without a system like polyvagal theory, yoga remains yoga. It doesn't translate into contemporary neurophysiology, doesn't translate into the mechanisms of optimistic or let's say optimal health or illness. And I think what polyvagal theory does is it gives it a translation. That so I don't see anything, it's everything is important. I don't mean to minimize the contribution of polyvagal theory, but I see it that yoga is a complete integrated system on multiple levels, including, we could say, a philosophy of life. But it conveys its actual building blocks can be translated into the constructs that are neuroanatomically and neurophysiologically described in polyvagal theory. And so I see it's helpful to yoga. I don't think it is yoga.
I understand.
Mm.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm really building on that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you call these neural exercises and the
Yeah,
five global states and how these neural platforms interact?
yeah. So we basically have three circuits. We could call that a circuit of with that ventral vagal circuit, this newer mammalian one, which has this capacity to downregulate threat. We have a sympathetic fight-flight system, which well, a sympathetic nervous system that can be co-opted to fight-flight behaviors. And we have this dorsal vagus, this older vagal circuit, which you can see it in snakes or other reptiles when they immobilize. And reptiles can immobilize for long periods of time and even not breathe for a couple hours because the brains are small. But mammals have big brains, and so they can't really go into that dorsal vagal one for long periods of time. And if they go there, they better adapt that reaction in future cases, not to totally shut down, pass out, because they wouldn't have enough oxygen to their brain. So we have those three, and they're kind of, let's view them as pure states. So, and this actually overlaps with the yoga as well. You have pure states, and you have these other hybrid states. So you have the social engagement system with the ventral vagus, and we're smiling and we're happy. We have the sympathetics being recruited for defense, and we're aggressive and fighting with each other. And we have the dorsal vagus, which, when it's doing its job, we have good digestion and all the organs below the diaphragm are fine. But under threat, we get it in the gut. And in the world we live in, many people have irritable bowel and literally gut problems because they're basically absorbing or living through chronic threat. Okay, so we now have those basic ones, but we also have hybrids. So if we take the social engagement system and mobilize, we call that dance or play. And now we are looking at each other so that our movements do not elicit threat reactions. That's why we're looking at each other. You can watch animals play, and if an animal is not making face-to-face contact, they're no longer playing. And if we watch kids on the playground, it's the same thing. And again, going to your interest in autism, children with autism are often in a physiological state of defensive immobilization, and they're not sending cues of safety to those that they may want to play with. So they're not always welcomed into groups because if they're not making eye contact, someone's going to get hurt. So when a play is a dance, when kids play with each other, they're aware of each other's presence, and that's a neural exercise. So dance and movement is this uh, utilizing mobilization, sympathetic activity, but also keeping it contained through social engagement. Similarly, we can literally immobilize without going into a state of life threat if someone is next to us talking sweet nothings into our ear. So we're in a sense being reassured by the vocal attribute of the social engagement system that our bodies are safe to be close to each other. This is a mother and a baby or two peers. This is how proximity, where you no longer need to look at the person's face, you hear the voice and you interpret their presence. And this becomes, as I said, shared moments of intimacy, which do not need to be sexual. They're moments where bodies feel safe with each other. And then you have, if you take away that social engagement system, that system of immobilization becomes really fear-based and shutting down. And of course, people with trauma histories will talk about wanting to be embraced, but when they are embraced, their bodies get reactive because the system has a memory of injury. Now, what happens? Remember, I was saying about shutting down, you don't want to do that too often because you need oxygen. Well, there's an adaptation where you now utilize sufficient amount of sympathetic tone so that when you immobilize, you're freezing, you're not passing out. And or you're dissociating, you're not passing out. So the body has these various strategies, or so the nervous system does, to keep us alive. So freezing and dissociation are really advanced innervations of the nervous system to say you're under threat, but if you shut down, it may be lethal. So it's making those decisions for you. So that gives you, let's say, five functional states coming out of those three circuits. There probably could be other hybrids in different ways. But I started off just describing the three, and then I realized it didn't cover everything, and I started modifying it over time.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about trauma and trauma therapy? I mean, we're living in such a traumatized world.
Yeah. Um, First of all, the way you say it almost assumes that there was a time when we didn't.
Right.
So, and so, like, even in titling the book Polyvagal Safety, there is a visualization that somewhere in our a collective unconsciousness, if I can use that term, there is a notion of what it would be like if we lived in a world that was safe. And I like to always talk about the core of humanity, the core of people. This is like Gabor's humanity, but the core of being human to me is to be generous, compassionate, uh, to be accessible. And I think the core of people tends to be really admirable, but we have wrappers to protect us. Just visualize these wrappers. And those wrappers could be called defense mechanisms. And our society says you live under threat all the time. And if you are not under threat, we're going to tell you that you are under threat. Think of the educational process and think of the medical system. You go into physicians for assessments, not for, is that shared journeys of wellness. You're going in there to get the test, and you basically hope the tests are okay. Everything is about measurement, and that measurement is an assessment. And when our nervous system detects that we're being evaluated, we're already under threat. What's the educational model? Assessment, assessment, assessment. What's the work model? Productivity all the time. Now, our nervous system is really quite agile. We can deal with this uh, really well for short periods of time. What we need are some periods of time where we are no longer, let's say, hypervigilant or under states of defense. We need select relationships where we can just feel that we are ourselves. We don't need to have any of the wrappers. Unfortunately, what happens with society is society pushes us more and more into a toxic, we use words like toxic stress or chronic threat. I basically say, let's get rid of those words and let's use something very simple. We're under threat, and we're disrupting our body's ability to support health, growth, and restoration. It's as simple as that. Our body's homeostatic functions are disrupted by the ambience of the world that we're in. So we're not optimizing our experience, our creativity, our love, our trust, our social abilities to help each other. We're doing absolutely the opposite.
Right. Thank you. Now, before we get to our audience questions, I just the closing chapter of polyvagal safety, you touch on the coronavirus pandemic and the polyvagal theory outlook on how that's impacting our nervous systems. Can you go into that?
Yeah, I wrote that paper at the bequest of a journal editor who was a psychiatry journal, and he wanted a editorial about what I thought was going on. And I basically viewed it as a paradox between avoiding threat and being exposed to more threats. So the virus itself is threatening, it's real. So the history of humanity is that we avoid threats. But how do we mitigate threats? We mitigate it through social interactions, or with a polyvagal terminology, through co-regulation with another. So we're sending each other cues back and forth of our social engagement system. That's turning on our ventral vagal circuit, and we go back to a more homeostatic physiological state of calmness and relaxation and trust. But what happened? What was the public health message, and what it is still? And that is, be careful, distance yourself from other people. So in most people's social world, before the pandemic, we didn't just interact with our spouse or family. We interacted with a variety of friends, and we had select friends that we would be with to deal with, different types of, let's say, challenges in our life. What happened during the pandemic is other people became a source of threat. And so you end up retuning your autonomic nervous system. And I want to bring this whole notion up of retuned autonomic nervous system and actually bring it back to the very beginning. Polyvagal theory brings to the clinical arena the emphasis that our physiological state is an important intervening variable between the world outside the body and the reactions of the body. So if you are a therapist or you're a teacher, whatever you're doing, your client or your even your spouse, their reactions are not cognitive reactions based upon the validity of what you're saying. It's based upon the physiological state they're in. So we have to be very aware that as our physiology retunes to a more threatened state, we become very biased towards negativity. And so we blame others and we get angry. We become reactive much easier. Now, during the pandemic, we have really unusual situations, especially working from home and having kids at home. I have no idea how professional families can function or have functioned. I have no idea how it would be for a teenager not to be able to be co-regulate with friends and being literally in a room with their family. So there's almost this model: you're home with your family, and that's all good. But we already know that there's a significant number of family environments that are toxic. There are toxic marriages. There are toxic parenting, and so the long-term outcome of this is going to take time. We've been doing research during the pandemic on individuals who got the virus and those that did not. And this is where we start redefining pre-existing conditions. So we did a study with over 1,500 people who did not get the virus, and looked at their mental health symptoms. And we measured their adversity history, meaning their trauma history, and we measured their subjective autonomic reactivity. How were they describing their body? Now, based upon the study, we found that adversity history was linearly related to mental health, I should say, linearly related to autonomic reactivity. And autonomic reactivity was the major determinant of mental health outcome. So there was very little unique variance or predictive value of adversity history, other than it changed or retuned the autonomic nervous system, meaning that it made the autonomic nervous system uh, more threat reactive. Then we had 100 individuals who had COVID. And I thought all those individual differences relating adversity to autonomic reactivity would drop out with COVID, because COVID is such a powerful autonomic disruptor itself. But it didn't. It amplified the effect of adversity history and elevated it. It amplified it. It made the slope. So adversity history was more of a predictor of mental health outcome, even if you had COVID. And so it changes the world, because we've heard a lot of statements about pre-existing conditions, and that was about survival, and that was that if you had pre-existing conditions, then you're more likely to get COVID, you're more likely to have a poor outcome. And what I am saying is, we don't know about health outcomes, we know about mental health outcomes. And adversity history is an extraordinarily powerful predictor of how an individual will react. So if you take the adversity history and you see if it changed the autonomic nervous system, which it tends to do, it's that group that had the retuned autonomic nervous system that has the poor outcomes. And that's the test of the polyvagal theory. It says if your intervening variable, your physiological reactivity, has changed, then the outcomes are going to be poor.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now we've got a lot of great questions from our live audience here. The first one, it relates to COVID. It's from Shauna, and she asks, can co-regulation happen effectively over telephone or video calls? Asking from the perspective of offering counseling
Hmm.
through these modalities as opposed to in person.
That's an excellent question, and my response is what I've been hearing from the therapeutic clinical world, and that is they seem to think it's working extraordinarily well, and they think it's working really well with those with severe trauma. And part of the reason is that the client can deal with it from their own home. They're in a safer environment, and they have agency. They can turn off the camera, or they could ask the therapist to turn off the camera. They have, in a sense, more control in the therapeutic setting. And the feedback from therapists is also that it's initially they thought was really challenging, but many of them like it very much. So the answer is really, it seems to work well. And the point, I think the question is really about even on personal co-regulation. So for me, what I try to describe is, what did the pandemic do to me? It's retuned me. I don't like going out. I don't want to go on an airplane. I don't want to go to an airport. And it's not a fear of getting the virus. It's a trepidation about being around people. And this was not who I was before. I'd love to be around people. So I found that very interesting. So for me, my co-regulation often occurs just as we're talking to each other, Ross. So this is my social event for the day.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. There's a question from Leah who asks, I am an alternative health professional, a massage therapist, with a decent knowledge of neuroanatomy. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, correct or right? She says. And then she asks, what makes the vagus nerve important in quote unquote trauma memory storage within the muscles and joints?
Well, let's basically reframe our understanding of cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are nerves that come off the brainstem, and the vagus is the 10th of 12 cranial nerves. But the cranial nerves, the way people learn them, is they start making the assumption that they're a unitary nerve. The exit from the brainstem is that of a conduit. So the vagus is actually coming off the brainstem from two different areas, that dorsal area and the ventral area, plus oodles of sensory information. So 80% of the vagus is sensory, 6% or so, or 3% are myelinated ventral vagal fibers, and that means there must be about 17% there dorsal vagal fibers going down, and I said about 80% coming up. The point is that it's a collection of fibers doing different jobs, different pathways. The issue of what her question relates to is when the nervous system calms down, and as she was a massage therapist, correct?
Yes.
When the nervous system calms down, the muscles relax. So that if you're in a high state of sympathetic tonicity, there's going to be high muscle tension. And the body, when it relaxes, the feedback from the body is regulating. Is that relaxation has a major vagal component. And when the relaxation is there, then the body can deal with things that it can't deal with in a state of tension. In a state of tension, everything is biased towards threat and defense. So when the body's relaxing, it can accommodate both neuromuscularly, but also in dealing with the memories that are coming up through the therapy.
Right. Okay. Thank you. There's a number of yoga related questions. I think the Banyan community has a particular interest, likely, in mind body therapies. This one is from Tara. And just so you know, Tara, Dr. Porges does touch on this in the book. She says, yoga is a South Asian contribution to moral philosophy. Have you done any research in yoga and polyvagal theory that doesn't have anything to do with specific practices and instead is more to do with the basic normative ethical contribution of yoga, where right choice is prioritized in decision making over good outcome? She's interested in the effect this kind of decision making might have on the nervous system.
Well, no, I have not, but that doesn't mean I won't comment on this. There is uh, a YouTube that I did with David Bercelli, who created TRE, and it's called Polyvagal Theory and Spirituality. But it's the same, it's going to give the same answer that when our nervous system is in a state of safety, then the ethical considerations, the spiritual ones, and the relationship with others is very different than when our nervous system is in a state of threat. And I think the underlying yoga philosophy and the ethics that she's referring to would be consistent.
Okay, thank you.
But it would be consistent, but not as detailed or worked out. So I'm basically saying here are the principles, but the actual system isn't there. I mean, someone would have to do that literature,
Right,
write that paper.
right. Okay. You did mention that portion was driven by your associate who
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And Mara Lisa has written several books, at least two books that I know of, on yoga and yoga therapy. And she's a good scholar as well as an amazing, yoga person.
Wonderful. Thank you. This is an interesting question. I, it's from Ginny, who asks, how do you create opportunities for polyvagal safety for folks who continue to be impacted by the dominant culture's oppression and systemic racism?
Uh, I, am I speechless? The issue is, uh, I was given, this is a common type question, and it says, what people were asking me, similar questions like, how do they deal with relatives who are followers of Trump? How can they have an interaction with those people? And my comment to all that is the worst thing is to try to argue the points. And I basically emphasize that what people really want is to be heard. They want their voice heard. The problem is listening to some of these voices are triggers to so many of us, and that makes it very difficult. I will tell you a little story about how I dealt with this in one situation. We were moving, and the moving van came in, and the driver came in. He looked at me and says, "You look like an academic." And usually, when someone says that, you think it's a compliment or something. And I said, "Yeah, I'm an academic." He says, "Well, I don't like academics," and I said, "Tell me why." He says, "Well, they have these liberal viewpoints. They're trying to. I don't want my kids to go to college. They'll end up with these viewpoints, et cetera, et cetera." And then I tried to probe him with minimum wage type question. Start going. So he had bought the whole thing, and then I just listened, and he rambled and vented for a while, and he left. He moved the materials, and then my wife was meeting the truck at the new house. He comes in, and he says, "I had really a great conversation with your husband." The point was that I didn't argue with him. I listened to him. And I think it's the listening that we need to learn, the witnessing of another. I'm not saying it's easy because we all are, in a sense, we're triggered by these comments. They make us feel bad and we get angry. But what that is saying is our physiology is becoming aggressive and defensive. So there is no space for the human to human interaction. But if we can witness, we can calm. And when we calm, then there becomes flexibility because that physiological state of inviting that social engagement system in creates a flexibility of co-regulation to occur. I'm not guaranteeing it. I'm saying the opportunity, you have to have that calm physiological state to go somewhere. You're not going to convince anyone, not now. I think that's part of the lessons that we're learning, that it doesn't appear that you convince people with information.
Thank you. This is an interesting question from Shannon. She asks, how do antidepressants affect the vagus nerve?
Um, it's a good question. I did one study a few decades ago, and the effect of it really appeared okay, in some people it has, okay, the effectiveness of the drug seemed to be related to whether or not it affected the vagus, meaning if it resulted in a depression of the vagal activity, the drugs didn't work. So there is some literature on that. So the question is, it doesn't increase the vagal activity. It's going from a different mechanism. But sometimes these drugs actually interfere. They have anticholinergic, which is a neurotransmitter of the vagus. They have a degree of blocking how the vagus works. So they actually become paradoxical. They, in a sense, remove the capacity of the vagal brake while trying to stimulate higher brain structures that would reduce anxiety. So the answer is that, first of all, the literature is not well developed on that question. The other point is that it would be interesting, again, taking a polyvagal perspective, that if one measured that intervening variable, that physiological state, and then made predictions on outcome by the degree that the vagus was affected or not affected.
Thanks. There's a question. I think this will be the last from our audience. Thanks, everybody, for the great questions. This is from Lee, who asks, how do you strengthen vagal tone with people who feel unsafe in their bodies or struggle with yoga, deep breathing, or
Hmm.
other physical signaling?
Well, I think bringing it up in the yoga community is an important question because many people gravitate to yoga for multiple things: to feel better and a little bit to feel better within a safe community. So you start having all these things going on. Yet people who walk into the studio with severe trauma histories, certain manipulations, including breathing, become triggers. Closing one's eyes can be a trigger. So there is, okay, one might want a personalized way of dealing with those who are aware enough that their body is that fragile. Uh, but the question is, it's a good question of not everyone comes into these environments with a neural accessibility or neurally welcoming what's going on. So the neural exercises are playfulness, social engagement, or part of the neural exercise that could be recruited for these individuals who have difficulty is uh, breathing exercises until they become destabilizing, and then movement. So you give them toolkits to experience their body. So if you're doing slow exhalations or slow breathing patterns and the body says can't go there, well, then you move and then you go back to it again. So in a sense, giving agency or control to the client about their physiological state, even though they can't go into true states of prolonged safety.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like to just hear a little bit before we close about, first of all, where you're focusing your efforts going forward, and also a bit about the safe and sound protocol.
Yeah. Well, let's talk safe and sound first. Safe and sound protocol is really based on neuroception of safety. So what happens to a nervous system when when cues of safety are being delivered acoustically in a program that is functioning like a treadmill. It's like a neural exercise, and where the frequency band of perceptual advantage is being expanded and contracted and exercised. And it's based on the premise that you can get this acoustic simulation in, and then the cortex interprets it, and then it comes back down into the ventral vagal complex, regulating those middle ear muscles, but also regulating the cardioinhibitory, the vagal. So it becomes a acoustic vagal nerve stimulator, and actually received a patent for that claim. So, many people report this calmingness, but what seems to be universal is the face lightens up. So you start in a sense, so when the middle of your muscles are working, the upper part of the face starts becoming more dynamically regulated. So people see it. Again, it's a lot of things that we never knew how to quantify. I like that person's smile. We didn't know what we were looking at, but you can see it changing, and then you know what you're looking at. So that's the safe and sound protocol. It's a theory driven based on the neuroception of acoustic stimuli that are functionally female voices within the perceptual band, the frequency band of perceptual advantage, and which is really the frequencies that we as humans use for social communication. So high and low frequencies are just taken out of the program. So, it's just a visualize an exercise system. Now, the other question was,
Where, I mean, there's so much application for all of your
oh,
studies.
oh,
What are
oh,
you focusing on going forward?
oh, well, we created a not-for-profit called the Polyvagal Institute, and that is really developing educational materials educational materials in various fields, including education, medicine, mental health, of course, yoga. There's, in a sense, we're developing even architecture. So there are now something like 3 or 4 architects who are polyvagal informed, who want to get the notion of space as healing in the curriculum of that. I'm really also working with a healthcare system to transform their clinics into becoming polyvagal informed clinics, which means to be more welcoming, more shared journey of wellness. The environment would be less evaluative. It's a big challenge because we're dealing with things, but this group wants to do it, so we're excited by it. So my goals, which is really what you're asking, is I really would like to see polyvagal theory have impact on the educational system, on how children are treated, and how schools are organized. They can't be so, in a sense, top down. You have to sit in a room. You have to have an understanding of what the nervous system can handle, and they have to be more fun for the child. So, in a sense, schools seem to have given up the power of play, and the power of play provides you with the resource to be resilient and to sit still for several hours. And they pushed that out and wanted them to sit still. And they got the kids who can't sit still, and now they're trying to functionally use pharmaceuticals or get them out of their school systems. So because the underlying physiology of the child within the context of schools is not very easily regulated. Remember, schools are not safe either. There's shaming, there's bullying, and there are other threats. So education, medicine are big on my agenda, where I'm working. That's what I'm working on now.
That's wonderful. Very wonderful. Now, if people want to learn more about you, where should they go?
They should go to Polyvagal, let's see, it's polyvagalinstitute1word.org to see that webpage. And they can also go to my own webpage, stephenporges.com, and there'll be information. On Polyvagal Institute, the whole idea was to create niches. So we actually have affinity groups where people are joining to create community. So there's a self-organizing yoga group on there now with I don't know, maybe 200 people now. So it's quite exciting to watch these areas grow and people talk to each other and become innovative. So my final comment, or let's say, I'm assuming it's my final comment, is that polyvagal theory is a theory that is to be applied, is to be expanded, it's to be modified for various needs. It's a set of principles. So the second really major paper that I wrote on polyvagal theory, I didn't even call it polyvagal theory. I called it polyvagal perspective, because I wanted to emphasize this importance of our physiological state in the world that we live in.
Beautiful. Dr. Stephen Porges, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Ross. It's been an interesting hour, and thank you for the good questions and for leading me through that. Thank you.
Wishing everyone a wonderful day. Thanks to Jacob, our producer, and everyone in the Banyan Books community. Dr. Porges' book is called Polyvagal Safety: Attachment, Communication, Self-Regulation. Thanks again, Dr. Porges.
Oh, you're welcome, Ross. Thank you.